I've been involved in a number of the major treatment studies establishing the evidence base for a variety of childhood conditions. And one of the last really to come online are the anxiety disorders. So we've moved through ADHD, we've moved through teen depression, and the anxiety disorders were kind of under-recognized, underappreciated in terms of their prevalence as well as their morbidity, and underappreciated in terms of their sensitivity to treatment. I think we found in the beginning of 2009 that the anxiety disorders are exquisitely responsive to both cognitive behavioral therapy as well as to psychopharmacologic treatments, particularly antidepressants. It really is an evolution of the field, and I've been involved in kind of establishing the evidence base for a number of years in my career, and anxiety was an important condition that we had to take on. You know, it's interesting, if you look at the history of child psychiatry, we knew that stimulants worked for hyperactivity in the mid-1930s, right? And we began to identify the value of antidepressants in the 1950s. And lithium for mania was also identified in the 50s. We first began to recognize that depression impacted teens in the mid-1980s. And we've kind of historically moved through a variety of different conditions in child psychiatry. And anxiety, while it's a relative of obsessive compulsive disorder, those conditions really finally came. And I think it's in part because they impact largely prepubertal population. That's when the disorder starts. And oftentimes they were viewed as conditions that were mostly neurotic, if you will, or temperamental. They weren't really viewed as kind of serious illnesses that they are. And so it's taken some time to get them up on the agenda, and we really accomplished the establishing of the evidence base in the beginning of 2009. The Youth Anxiety Center is a collaborative effort between New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, and the Weill Cornell Medical College. Faculty and staff from those three institutions work together to build the Youth Anxiety Center. And it's focused on a group of young people ages 16 to 28 who have anxiety in their history and who are really struggling with making that transition into adulthood. And the way we understand why they're struggling is as the anxiety disorders really begin pre-pubertally, between 6 and 12, anxious kids are very consistent in their coping style. They avoid whatever makes them anxious. And parents, modern parents who are sensitive to their kids' capacity for emotional upset, will do almost anything to keep their kids from becoming anxious or upset. And so they accommodate to their youngsters' anxiety. So the combination of the child wanting to avoid and the parents facilitating avoidance essentially sets anxious youth on a pathway to not develop adequate adaptation and coping as they move into adolescence and young adulthood. So if you think about how we all learn to be robust in our adaptation and coping, it's we try something, we fail, we try it again, then succeed, we try and we fail. But if you're anxious, you see a new situation and you tend to avoid it, so you don't do those kinds of things that you need to do to naturally build robust coping and adaptation. These kids can do extremely well until they're 15, 16, 17 years of age, but as they begin to transition into adolescent peer groups, as they begin to think about transitioning into college, all of a sudden their coping skills are really not adequate for the social pressures, the academic pressures, the independent living pressures. And we see these youngsters begin to break down. So what we do in the Youth Anxiety Center is we treat their anxiety, which is really important, but we also work on the accumulated disability. For many of these kids that we're seeing at 17, 18, 19, they've been anxious for well over a decade using avoidance coping, and their parents have been accommodating them for a really long time. So they actually have to learn how to live again. They have to learn how to cope and adapt, and in a way that their same age peers don't have to do. So it's a real struggle for them, and so we provide family work, we provide group treatment, we do good psychopharm of the underlying anxiety disorder. And what we find is that kids really take to this once they understand what anxiety is and how it's had an impact on them. And I wish many of the kids had been treated when they were younger, but it's good to know that this is a group of young people now who really can come to treatment. It's kind of ironic. Child psychiatrists sometimes work until they're 16, 17, and 18, and then hand them over to adult psychiatrists. But this is a population of people who really had a childhood onset anxiety disorder, and all of their accumulated disability occurred during childhood and adolescence. And so on some level, it's really quite appropriate that child psychiatrists even work with 23, 25, 28-year-olds who suffer from anxiety, in part because their condition is so developmentally oriented.